My name's Hedwig.
How old are you?
9?
I've never seen a case like this before. 23 identities live in Kevin's body. Who are you?
What happens when horror is used not just to scare us, but to make mental illness feel palpable, visible, and even dangerous? In Manic VR and Split, horror aesthetics don't simply decorate the stories, rather they shape how we understand bipolar disorder and dissociative identity disorder, and they reveal very different attitudes towards empathy, the spectacle of horror and representation of mental illness. Let's start by introducing the two works. Split is a psychological horror film directed by M. Night Shyamalan, and it follows Kevin Wendell Crumb, a man living with DID, who kidnaps 3 teenage girls and holds them captive in an underground facility. As the film unfolds, the audience is introduced to Kevin's different identities, while the girls simultaneously try to escape and survive. Unlike Manic, it's not a testimonial or documentary work, but a fictional thriller built around ideas of suspense, violence, and other classic horror tropes. Split is undoubtedly a product of popular cinema. It's a high-budget commercial product that aims to entertain more than anything. On the other hand, Manic VR is a virtual reality experience that explores bipolar disorder through immersive storytelling and testimonial narration. Rather than observing from a distance, such as in a film, the viewer is placed inside of an environment that's shaped by different sounds, spaces, and first-person accounts from people affected by the condition. The experience uses the VR medium to simulate the emotional and psychological disorientation and encourages empathy and reflection by letting the audience feel rather than simply watch the effects of bipolar disorder. While both Manic VR and Split draw on horror aesthetics to create their images of mental illness, they do so through very different forms of media, narrative strategies, and even ethical intentions. This essay ultimately asks the question, how do VR and popular cinema use horror conventions to shape representations of mental illness, and what are the implications of those choices for empathy, perception, and storytelling? To better understand how these two works construct mental illness through horror, I'll draw on several key concepts. First, I'll use Trisha Austin's idea of narrative environments. For Austin, VR landscapes have the possibility of being critically immersive, which means we're not only immersed in the spaces, but rather they provide us with an opportunity to reflect and learn. This concept of immersion as the primary aspect of VR that sets it apart from other forms of media is crucial for the purposes of this essay. Most importantly, we'll look at Agnes Bach's argument regarding immersion in VR, and specifically how this immersion, presence, and interactivity positions VR as a more suitable medium for depicting mental illness. And lastly, we'll look at the concept of the ableist conflation, the idea that disability is inherently linked with experiences of pain and suffering, and how the two works being analyzed either subvert or reinforce this concept. Finally, let's take a closer look at the two works. I want to begin by considering Austin's concept of narrative environments in Manic VR, and then compare it to the more traditional storytelling found in Split. Austin's argument is useful here because it frames the spatiality of these VR programs as more than just a setting, which is especially evident in the way that Manic VR uses space to tell the story of bipolar disorder. Rather than distancing the viewer physically or emotionally from the narrative as in a film, Manic VR uses its immersion to create a more reflective account of bipolar disorder that pairs these immersive elements with its horror aesthetics, which we will dive further into. While Manic uses immersion to invite the viewer into an artistic representation of mental illness that encourages empathy, Split approaches mental illness in a very different way while still focusing on environmental storytelling and immersion. The film uses spaces such as underground layers, locked rooms, and other spaces that don't function to deepen an understanding of DID, but instead create this sense of danger, entrapment, and violence. The setting is important because it becomes a dramatic device that essentially reinforces the film's association between DID, or mental illness generally, and criminality and violence, rather than a meaningful environment that helps the audience to understand mental illness. Now, let's shift to talking about the use of horror aesthetics in each of these pieces. In Manic VR, horror aesthetics are used somewhat sparingly, but in a way that is still unsettling while still purposeful. The first use of these ideas in Manic that I want to address is its choice to place us in visually horrific spaces. The first instance of this comes almost halfway through the piece, where we are placed in an extremely dark bedroom. Darkness envelops us, and we have no perception of our surroundings. Our placement in this unsettling space generates a profound sense of discomfort that's heightened by the spoken dialogue which refers to seeing spirits, and a score in the back that mimics those in horror films that precede a big scare.
It's very poetic. I was taking photographs and I saw these ghosts in my room. I was visited by all these spirits, and it felt like I was like pausing time, and then it looked like the spirits, they were like looking back at me as if they were captured into this separate realm.
This feeling is replicated in several different scenes spanning from dark wooded areas to jail cells where shadows lurk, and dark, inescapable hallways that drown us with water. These scenes are cut together in a way that prohibits us from getting comfortable in any one location, and includes these physical representations of fear and discomfort using items like knives, shadows, and light. All of these tactics create a sense of disorientation that mirrors the emotional instability and sensory overwhelm associated with bipolar disorder. The consequence of this approach is that horror becomes productive in that it does not simply sensationalize mental illness, but it helps the audience understand its lived realities. By contrast, Split uses horror aesthetics in a much more exploitative way. Specifically, the majority of the film takes place in an unknown, dark, and dingy basement. This backdrop creates a baseline level of fear and disorientation that serves the other horror elements being used, most importantly for this film being James McAvoy's brilliant portrayal of Kevin, our main antagonist.
Maybe she can help us.
We're here! Help us! We're in here!
Don't worry. He's not allowed to touch you. He knows what you're here for. He listens to me.
While the movie relies on some traditional horror tropes such as low lighting, tense scores, and a dingy and dirty mise-en-scène, and of course jump scares, it's primarily McAvoy's character that generates most of the horror in the film. The various identities that we explore throughout the film create a dreadful sense of uncertainty, and his character essentially embodies chaos, violence, and a sheer lack of empathy for human life as a result of his DID. The result here is that mental illness is framed as threatening and alien, with the audience encouraged to fear the character rather than understand him. The consequence is a harmful one. Rather than challenging stigmas such as the ableist conflation, the film tends to reproduce them by linking psychological differences with violence, instability, and horror. It's here that I want to refer to Agnes Bach's representing mental disorders. Bach specifically addresses the comparison at hand between film and VR's capability to adequately represent mental illness. Bach's argument falls in line with our comparison of film and VR thus far. Bach references Aaron Heath, who says, "Mental disorders do not generally appear in ways that demonstrate real people's lived experiences. Films intentionally make psychological breakdowns immediate and narratively convenient to provide audiences with an entertaining emotional struggle." Bach continues the claim by arguing that many American films fail to be medically accurate and rather perpetuate the stigma surrounding mental illness. In the end, Bach ultimately argues that VR may be able to subvert these reductionist depictions of mental illness. Bach says, "Meanwhile, VR can offer, through its special affordances, a stronger sense of presence and embodiment, which influences creators to be more careful when creating these kinds of strong, immersive experiences, and to study and represent various types of mental health disorders in more multi-layered and complex ways." Now, to conclude, I want to shift to talking about the concept mentioned at the start of this video, the ableist conflation. The ableist conflation, again, is this idea that the disabled life is one of pain and suffering. If we look at both of these works side by side, it's clear which one is aiming to subvert this conflation and which one is blatantly perpetuating it. Through our analysis, we have seen the ways in which Manic VR aims to be a more faithful digital representation of mental illness. Rather than using it as a jumping pad for the perfect, violent antagonist, it frames mental illness as a personal journey, one filled with discomfort, dread, fear, and uncertainty. Instead of presenting bipolar disorder as something to be feared, it invites the user into a highly immersive and emotional approximation of their lived experiences, where disorientation, intensity, and instability are framed as symptoms and conditions to be felt and reflected upon, and not mocked or sensationalized as they are in Split. In this sense, the work resists the assumption that disability must be read as something negative. Most importantly, however, it recognizes that immersive media can produce experiences in ways that challenge the ableist conflation of these normative psychological and physiological states. By contrast, however, Split perpetuates these very assumptions in almost every manner. Our main antagonist is the only representative of mental illness, and thus his simple existence is one that paints non-normative psychological states as something violent, something chaotic, and something to fear. The audience is meant to associate mental illness with threat and danger, which reinforce so much of the negative stigma surrounding illnesses such as DID. And lastly, instead of complicating or providing nuance to the condition of DID, the film simplifies it into a spectacle of horror with the goal of generating massive profits in the box office. In the end, Split can be seen not only as an embodiment of the ableist conflation, but one that extends the ideas of pain and suffering to violence. In the end, Manic VR and Split show how horror can be used either to deepen understanding of mental illness or to reinforce the stigma surrounding them. One invites us to feel the instability of mental illness and generates empathy and care, where the other simply turns it into mere entertainment value.